History, a podcast that aims to go back in time to connect an event or instance to its origin through several threads of continuity across time, space, culture, and historic moments. Welcome to the podcast. I am your host, Mike Shellhammer. Today's episode connects the bright twinkle lights you see on everyone's houses in December to the burning of fires to stave off the darkness of winter in the ancient Roman Empire. It connects the smell of balsam wood and holly with the pagan roots of Northern Europe. Today, come with me to find the thread that brings us the origins of Christmas customs. Many years ago, I started writing a blog called The Faith and the Weird on a free blogspot site. I like to look at different insane or crazy pieces of the Bible and connect it to one's faith in the Christian religion today. As part of that, I wanted to research some of the origins for the traditions and customs celebrated at Christmas time. And I wrote about many different pieces. Many different customs and traditions, but I'll focus on a few of my favorites today. Why celebrate the birth of Christ on December 25th rather than another day? Why give gifts to one another? Why sing the ancient Yuletide carol? Why cut down an evergreen tree and then bring it inside and then decorate it with candles and lights? It turns out there's a lot about the Christmas celebration that can be traced to different traditions across the ancient world. It wasn't purely Christians creating these customs, and certainly not out of whole cloth. They had other influences to them. They borrowed, big time, from their neighbors, their converts, and the people that came before them. The traditions of celebration brought out at Christmas time are in many ways pagan and inclusive of the practices of cultures and religions not of Christian origin. Christmas is not the only holiday celebrated near the end of the calendar year. There are many in the major religions that celebrate during December. You have events like Hanukkah and Kwanzaa. There's the festival of Pancha Ganapati, which is a modern 5-day Hindu festival celebrated through the 21st and 25th of December to honor the god Ganesha. Whatever your faith or cultural traditions, the longest days of winter have long been a time of celebration around the world. Centuries before the arrival of the man called Jesus, early Europeans celebrated light and birth in the darkest of days. Many people rejoiced during the winter solstice, when the worst of the winter was thought to be behind them, and they could look forward to longer days and extended hours of sunlight. In fact, the solstice is the perfect time for celebration in most areas of Europe due to the climate. At that time of year, most cattle were slaughtered so that they would not have to be fed during the winter. For many people, it was the only time of year when they had a supply of fresh meat. Everything else would have to be dried or pickled or what have you. In addition, most wine and beer made during the year would have finally been fermented and ready for drinking. In Germany, for instance, people honored the pagan god Odin during the midwinter holiday. Germans were terrified of Odin, as they believed he made nocturnal flights through the sky to observe his people, and then he would decide who would prosper or perish from those flights. Because of his presence in the sky during these dark days, many people chose to stay inside. The first custom or tradition that we're going to examine today is the actual celebration date for Christmas. The date of Jesus' birth, if you don't know, Christmas is a celebration of Jesus of Nazareth, his birth and his ministry beyond that, talked about in the Christian Bible. I'm sure you know that already. Most people, I imagine, would. But the idea of him being born in December is not talked about at all. So it's been debated for centuries. Most scholars argue it was actually in the fall, with varying degrees of, tinfoil hats as proof. Quite literally, people just going off the deep end. trying to figure out when Jesus was born, based on star charts, based on astrology and the Magi, which I'm not going to mention again this time, but I will talk about their tradition at some point in the future. It's all kind of interesting stuff if you're a person of faith, which I tend to be, but not in a lot of the more practiced senses today. And so whether they're secular scholars, whether they're religious scholars, no one can know for sure. Even you couple it with a bunch of the different things we can find as being sort of historically accurate, or at least historically done, like the counting of the Roman census, which is spoken of in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2. The date and time of year haven't been reliably determined. Pope Julius I was the leader of the Christian church in the mid-4th century, over 300 years after Jesus' death, and he was the first to arrive, or at least it's talked about him being the first to arrive at the date for December 25th, or at least as a authority to say that yes, this is the date that we're going to celebrate Jesus' birth. There are several stories as to how he arrived at that date, one of them being a source in the 3rd century giving December 25th to Julius I, and maybe he just rolled with that. I'm not quite sure there. Some scholars claim that he was trying to distance the Roman Empire's populace from the popular celebration of Saturnalia, which is done at the end of December. Another reason for the decision from Pope Julius I, may have been because in about a century before him, 274, the Roman Emperor Aurelian had allegedly declared December 25th the birth date of Sol Invictus. That's the victorious sun, the god of the Roman pantheon. And so Julius I may have thought that he could attract more converts to Christianity by allowing them to continue to celebrate on that same day, but instead of celebrating Saturnalia or the birthday of Sol Invictus, not Saturnalia. Saturnalia would have come before that in December. But they're saying, hey, you can celebrate the birthday. It's instead of the birthday of the sun, it's the birthday of the Son of God, Jesus. And so that's a theory that's out there. So he might have also been influenced by the idea that Jesus died on the anniversary of his conception, which is odd to me, but this was a tradition in martyrdom and Christian martyrs, Christians that would die for their faith. Jesus died during Passover. So in the 3rd century AD, Passover was celebrated on the 25th of March. Therefore, they would go 9 months ahead to say that, okay, if you died on the day you were conceived, which was a tradition to believe, then they would expect the birth to be on the 25th of December. One of the prevalent theories on why Christmas is December 25th is spelled out in The Golden Bough, a highly influential 19th century comparative study of religion and mythology written by the anthropologist Sir Fraser and originally published in 1890. I apologize, I deleted his first name. I think it's George. George is involved. George Fraser. Sir George Fraser, British guy, I imagine, since he's a sir. So Sir Fraser approached the topic of religion from a cultural perspective, not a theological perspective. And so he linked the dating of Christmas to earlier pagan rituals, in the same way perhaps potentially giving credence to the ideas from Pope Julius, or at least what were attributed to Pope Julius. The 1922 edition of The Golden Bough says this about the origins of Christmas, quote, "An instinctive relic of the long struggle is preserved in our festival of Christmas, which the Church seems to have borrowed directly from its heathen rival. In the Julian calendar, the 25th of December was reckoned the winter solstice, and it was regarded as the nativity of the sun, because the day begins to lengthen and the power of the sun to increase from that turning point of the year. The ritual of the Nativity, as it appears to have been celebrated in Syria and Egypt, was remarkable. The celebrants retired into certain inner shrines, from which at midnight they issued with a loud cry, "The Virgin has brought forth, the light is waxing." The Egyptians even represented the newborn son by the image of an infant, which on his birthday, the winter solstice, they brought forth and exhibited to his worshippers. No doubt the Virgin, who thus conceived and bore a son on the 25th of December, was the great Oriental goddess whom the Semites called the Heavenly Virgin, or simply the Heavenly Goddess. In Semitic lands, she was a form of Astarte. Now Mithra was regularly identified as his worshippers with the sun, the unconquered sun as they called him, hence his nativity also fell on the 25th of December. The Gospels say nothing as to the day of Christ's birth, and accordingly the early church did not celebrate it. In time, however, the Christians of Egypt came to regard the 6th of January as the date of the Nativity, and the custom of commemorating the birth of the Savior on that day gradually spread until, by the 4th century, it was universally established in the East. But at the end of the 3rd or the beginning of the 4th century, the Western Church, which had never recognized the 6th of January as the day of the Nativity, adopted the 25th of December as the true date, and in time, the decision was accepted also by the Eastern Church. At Antioch, the change was not introduced till about the year 375 AD. What considerations led the ecclesiastical authorities to institute the festival of Christmas? The motives for the innovation was started with the great frankness by the Syrian writer himself, a Christian. The reason, he tells us, why the fathers transferred the celebration of the 6th of January to the 25th of December was this. It was a custom of the heathen to celebrate on the same 25th of December, the birthday of the sun, at which they kindled lights in token of festivity. In these solemnities and festivities the Christians also took part. Accordingly, when the doctors of the church perceived that the Christians had a leaning to this festival, they took counsel and resolved that the true nativity should be solemnized on that day, and the festival of the Epiphany on the 6th of January. Accordingly, along with this custom, the practice has prevailed of kindling fires till the 6th. The heathen origin of Christmas is plainly hinted at, if not tacitly admitted, by Augustine when he exhorts his Christian brethren not to celebrate that solemn day, like the heathen on account of the sun, but on account of him who has made the sun. In like manner, Leo the Great rebuked the pestilent belief that Christmas was solemnized because of the birth of the new sun, as it was called, and not because of the nativity of Christ. Thus it appears that the Christian Church chose to celebrate the birthday of its founder on the 25th of December in order to transfer the devotion of the heathen from the sun to him who is called the Son of Righteousness." Unquote. That's a long quote, basically making the point, once again, that the connection is Christ's birth to Saturnalia, or the birth of the sun, which I have a name for, and I'll mention that later, but there are some, so it's associated with the pagan rituals of the society around them in ancient Rome, and that's where Pope Julius might have gotten his ideas. That's where previous scholars, they mentioned, Sir Fraser mentions Augustine, they might have gotten those ideas from those earlier church fathers. But to combat that narrative, an article titled "How December 25th Became Christmas" on the Biblical Archaeological Society's website takes some issue with that theory. Quote, "Despite its popularity today, this theory of Christmas's origins has its problems. It is not found in any ancient Christian writings, for one thing. Christian authors of the time do note a connection between the solstice and Jesus' birth. The church father Ambrose, who lived in the 4th century, for example, described Christ as the true Son, who outshone the fallen gods of the old order. But early Christian writers never hint at any recent calendrical engineering. They clearly don't think the date was chosen by the church. Rather, they see the coincidence as a providential sign, as natural proof that God had selected Jesus over the false pagan gods." Unquote. Further along in that same article, it mentions a date for Christmas being made around 200 AD, and I'd heard that elsewhere with the discussion from Pope Julius I borrowing from potentially work of Augustine. And they say that that was not a time where the Christian church was borrowing heavily from pagan traditions. It was in the 12th century that the first link between the date of Jesus' birth and the pagan feasts were made. And this is, once again, from the Biblical Archaeological Society. Quote, "Clearly there was great uncertainty, but also a considerable amount of interest in dating Jesus' birth in the late 2nd century. By the 4th century, however, we find references to two dates that were widely recognized, and now also celebrated, as Jesus' birthday: December 25th in the Western Roman Empire, and January 6th in the East, especially in Egypt and Asia Minor. The modern Armenian Church continues to celebrate Christmas on January 6th. For most Christians, however, December 25th would prevail, while January 6th eventually became known as the Feast of the Epiphany, commemorating the arrival of the Magi in Bethlehem. The period between became the holiday season, later known as the 12 Days of Christmas." Unquote. So, according to the Biblical Archaeological Society, the earliest mention of December 25th as being Jesus' birthday actually dates from a Roman almanac in the mid-4th century, which would be the time of Pope Julius I. And so you see how that sort of coincides there. So maybe there's more to this, or maybe there are multiple different theories that have a reason to be seen as the origin for December 25th being marked as the birth of Christ. A quote from their article again. Quote, "The Roman Almanac lists the death dates of various Christian bishops and martyrs. The first date listed, December 25th, is marked Natus Christus in Bethlehem, Judea, which translates to Christ was born in Bethlehem of Judea. So almost 300 years after Jesus was born, we finally find people observing his birth in midwinter." Unquote. So taking a long story that I just told you and putting in a too long didn't read, nobody knows for sure why December 25th is celebrated as Christmas. But that's the time of year that we just celebrate it, so that's what's happening. And we make our various celebrations and customs that come from other traditions as well. So let's take a look at one of those possible sources and compare the celebration with some of the customs of modern Christian celebrations. This might be surprising this might be surprisingly close to some of your traditions and some of your customs that you celebrate around Christmas. So I mentioned the ancient Roman pagan festivals around the end of December. I mentioned the date December 25th, and that it actually involves efforts to gather and feast and give gifts, and so I'm going to describe that for you guys and do a little bit of a deep dive real quick here. So the date of Christmas, it coincides with the end, or at least close to the end, of the feast of the ancient Roman religion at the time of Jesus, and it was called Saturnalia, as I mentioned before. The actual day of December 25th was claimed to be the birthday of the sun, and that is called Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, which translates to the festival of the unconquered sun. So you see how it was mentioned in the source from Sir Fraser, the idea that unconquered sun, S-U-N, could correspond to, or people of faith would correspond that to, well, Jesus is our son, the Son of God, S-O-N, or he's a metaphorical son, S-U-N. It all kind of fits together here. So, the Festival of the Unconquered Sun, and before the Festival of the Unconquered Sun on the 25th, you have Saturnalia. It was a festival like others in ancient Rome. They had parties, there was gift giving, there was wine, there was singing and dancing. This is the ancient Roman holiday that honors Saturn, the god of seed sowing, and celebrates the promise of a spring harvest. Originally, it was just one day, but over the centuries, the festivities grew to last a whole week, which is my kind of festival. starting on December 17th and covering the winter solstice on December 21st. In Rome, the holiday was kicked off with a religious ceremony in the Temple of Saturn, followed by a free public banquet open to all. The businesses and law courts were all closed, so everybody could take part. It was a truly, huge community holiday. When the Roman poet Statius attended Emperor Domitian's Saturnalia feast in late 1st century, he left this 5-star review, quote, "Who can sing of the spectacle, the unrestrained mirth, the banqueting, the unbought feast, the lavish streams of wine? Ah, now I faint, and drunken with thy liquor drag myself at last to sleep." Unquote. So high praise. During Saturnalia, a time of jovial merrymaking, many social norms were relaxed and even inverted. Gambling, which was normally outlawed, was allowed now in public. According to some accounts, you were only supposed to gamble for nuts, so you weren't gambling for money, and this was to recreate the golden age of Saturn. Knuckle bones, called tally, were used for games of chance. They could be rolled like dice or played like jacks. As their name implies, they were originally made from the foot bones of a goat or sheep, which made them easily accessible and very cheap. They were later fashioned from all sorts of materials like wood, stone, and terracotta, but from also fancier mediums like translucent glass, bronze, gold, ivory, and precious gems. In one ancient account, the god Saturn was featured as a witness describing his own festival. Quote, "Everywhere there is clapping and singing and playing games, and everyone, slave and free man, is held as good as his neighbor." Unquote. So doesn't that sound like some of the the Christmas revelry and the merrymaking that Americans and Western cultural adherents and people around the world that celebrate Christmas? Doesn't that sound like somebody's having a lot of fun on Christmas Day? Slave and free, the idea, obviously we don't support enslavement at all, but the idea that whatever class you're in, if you're in an underclass of people, if you're the working poor, if you're in poverty, if you're rich, it doesn't matter. Everybody treats each other the same. They treat them as good as their neighbor, is what Saturn literally says about his own festival. And doesn't that echo something biblical there? Doesn't that sound like Jesus? Treat everybody as good as your neighbor. During the Saturnalia Holy Week, a time of role reversal, enslaved people could attend the banquets and were celebrated with gifts and wine. This might even be echoed in the gifts given to children these days, and that has its origin somewhere else too, and I'll probably talk about it next Christmas time. But that started sometime in the Victorian time, somewhere in the 19th century. So also a bit of a role reversal. It's the parents dote upon the kids, and they're not seen as being spoiled. It's the one time of year where you can spoil your kids and no one will feel shame. And that's incredibly important for me as a parent. Strict Roman dress codes were also overturned in a similar way of the role reversals. Instead of the formal and unwieldy toga, which you might see, an Animal House, Romans of all ranks would put on a synthesis, which was spelled and sounds exactly how you would think, synthesis. But it was a comfortable and colorful dinner dress that was normally reserved for private dinner parties. Instead, they're showing up in public, and everyone's wearing their best. Everyone would wear a freedman's cap, which was a conical felt hat awarded to freed slaves to celebrate the liberty and free spirit of the holiday. Doesn't that kind of describe how people dress up in their holiday best, and they make friends, and they share eggnog, and everybody's, just having fun? In another topsy-turvy tradition, households would appoint a mock king, so literally somebody else other than the emperor, somebody else other than the king, however, some ruler for you, not a consul or proconsul. They're the lord of misrule, and they would reign over everyone in the house, and they'd give silly orders, like telling someone to shout embarrassing insults, to dance naked in the street, to chase others around the house. It's all lots of merrymaking and gaming, and Along with the drinking, feasting, and gambling, you had exchanging of gifts. It was a very popular Saturnalia tradition. And so now there's your Christmas gift exchange. In actuality, the Roman poet Martial described something like a white elephant gift exchange. Quote, "At this time of the year, when the equestrians and senators show off their party clothes, and even the emperor wears a freedman's cap, accept the gift you have drawn, whether from a poor or a rich man. Let everyone give his guest an appropriate gift." Unquote. Martial wrote epigrams, which are these short satirical poems for the many possible gifts of Saturnalia. These included things like fattened pigs, incense, turtle doves, so you might recognize that one from A Christmas Carol, glass cups, ivory knuckle bones, so you guys had something to play with, something to game with, lamps, clay statuettes, and that's just to name a few. For instance, a gold hairpin. Martial wrote an epigram for this. It goes like this, quote, "That your oiled tresses may not injure your splendid silk dress, let this pin fix your twisted hair and keep it up." Unquote. So just talking about all these, common gifts that you'd get during Saturnalia. Gold rings were also included on his gift list. This is Martial. And I'm half expecting something on this list to be a partridge in a pear tree, right? So, 5 gold rings. So the gold rings in ancient Rome, they actually had a special meaning. So it's not just, just gold, the value of the gold, the value of a ring. They had special meaning, and this would be during the Roman Republic. So this would be a couple hundred years before the time, or actually about 100 years before the time of Jesus, and stretching back a few centuries. During that time, only senators, magistrates, and knights, which they would be called eques, they had the right to wear the gold rings. So it was like a class symbol. Anybody else, if they were wearing a ring, they could only wear iron. By the time of the early Roman Empire, so this is right around the time of Jesus, customs were changed, and the members of the higher classes could give a gold ring to a freeborn citizen, or even a freedman, somebody that was formerly enslaved and became free, and that would raise them to the rank of eque. So during Saturnalia, a gold ring would be an amazing gift, and it would show that topsy-turvy sort of point of the whole holiday, of the whole festival. The idea that you might have been low, but now you're getting exalted because I'm giving you a gold ring. Martial's ring epigram, speaking from the perspective of the gold ring itself, reflects fondly on the generous gifts of the good old days. Quote, "In time, past friends often gave us as presents, but nowadays it rarely happens. Happy is he whose escort is a knight of his own making." Unquote. So that's saying that happy is the person who gave the gift of this position, the knighthood, to his friend. Wax candles and oil lamps were also popular Saturnalia gifts. During the dark days around the solstice, candles were reminders of the return of the sun after winter. This would be echoed in candles adorning Christmas trees in the Victorian era. In Roman homes, wax candles were placed as offerings on household altars to Saturn, especially during the final days of the festival. This was practical too, of course. Lots of lamps were needed to light the nighttime celebrations, and they did not have electric or gas lights in that time period. Drinking parties were an important part of Saturnalia, which was a time to drink the most delightful drinks, and be acclaimed a better singer in your cups than the next man, in the words of ancient satirist Lucian. In the ancient world, wine was almost always mixed with water, and sometimes honey or spices, in a large bowl, and then ladled into individual drinking cups. So there's your punch bowl. In the egalitarian spirit of the holiday, everyone, rich and poor, would partake of what was in the bowl. Even Cato the Elder, famous for his frugality, allocated extra wine to his farmhands, about 20 pints per person, during the Saturnalia festival. So given all of what we know about Saturnalia and the celebrations happening there, we have our understanding of possibly, that early Christians chose to celebrate Jesus' birth as a direct conflict with this festival, and many of its customs ended up becoming important in Christmas celebrations as opposed to Saturnalia celebrations. So with the festival being held even after the Christian religion became the official religion of the empire, it was undoubtedly an important cultural celebration. It wasn't just about celebrating Saturn anymore. And that's part of the basis for the idea of this somehow being a origin story for the December 25th being the birth of Christ and the celebration of Christmas. But as I mentioned before, it's something that is not settled by scholars and likely will never be settled by anybody. It's a convenient time of year nowadays, I suppose, to celebrate the birth of Christ. Another end-of-the-year celebration is held in Scandinavia in ancient times. The Norse celebrated Yule from December 21st, as we mentioned, it's the winter solstice, through the beginning of January. The solstice being the longest, darkest day in the northern hemisphere. Today, Yule and Yuletide are pretty synonymous with Christmas. They show up in the Deck of the Halls Christmas carol, but its origin is centuries before the arrival of Christ, and in fact, in a millennia before the celebration of Christmas as we know it today. Yule comes from the Old English Jul, which shares a history with the equivalent word from the Old Norse, which is Yule. Both these words referred to a midwinter festival centered around the winter solstice, which traditionally marked the halfway point of the winter season. And we've mentioned it before, after the solstice, which is the shortest part of daylight for the year, the day begins to grow longer, and so it's thought that Yule was a celebration of the reappearance of the sun and the fertile land's rebirth. The celebration of Yule was one of the oldest winter celebrations in the world. Ancient people in northern Europe would tend to be hunters and pastoralists, and they spent much of their time outdoors. Seasons and weather played a significant part in their lives. So the customs and traditions associated with Yule vary widely, but I'm going to give you some of the more common ones. The celebration consisted of a hearty feast and general revelry, which sounds like a lot of fun. It would include things like wassailing, which is, here we go, a wassailing, that's caroling, that's singing songs. Drinking alcohol, which is something you do around the holidays, of course, and then dancing. Burning a log in celebration of Yule started as part of these winter solstice festivities. The candles and lights associated with Christmas, meant to symbolize guiding beacons of the Christ child, probably evolved, or at least possibly, potentially, partially evolved from the Yule log. And that is lit to entice the sun to return as part of the Yule festival in Scandinavia. So in recognition of the return of the sun, the fathers and sons would bring home large logs, which they would set on fires. This is the Yule log. The people would feast until the log burned out, which could take as many as 12 days. The Norse believed that each spark from the fire represented a new pig or calf that would be born during the coming year. So I suppose you'd hope for lots of sparks off your Yule log. And it wasn't just some small log for a cooking fire. The Yule log was originally an entire tree trunk. That's why it took 12 days to burn down. It was very clearly something that was huge. Families would bring the trunk of the Yule tree inside and stick the big end of it into the fireplace. And then the log would feed the fire for 12 days and is now considered to be the origin for 12 days of Christmas. The Christmas day through the evening of the 12th night. And in fact, the ashes of those Yule logs were said to be very good for plants, so that would kind of support their idea of, the world coming back alive, and the Yule log helping to create new life. And they've tested this. It's actually, wood ashes are beneficial for use in the garden. So it makes sense that they would take it and then somehow associate it with this spiritual sort of celebration and festival. The idea of the Yule log bringing you better life in your garden, for your plants, for your crops, for the stuff that your pigs and your calves and all the other things that you grow would feast on. Today, of course, the Yule log is still a Christmas tradition in some cultures, which is then burned in the fireplace on Christmas Eve. It can even be a chocolate cake enjoyed as a Christmas dessert. What they recommend is that you plan to cut some of a white birch tree into Yule logs, and you can use them in your fireplace. You can use them as decor. You tie it with a red ribbon. You cut areas into it in order to burn candles, tea lights, tapers, whatever you've got. And in some cases, you have Christians, Catholics especially, taking their Advent candles and putting them into the Yule log. So they call the dessert recipe is, I believe it's bouche de Noël. I think it's French. But that would be the edible Yule log, which kind of looks like a giant ho-ho. Like what is that? Tasty cakes, I guess. Like a spiral dessert roll. So the Yule log that adorns many households in December has a spot on your dessert tray. Its origin is in ancient Scandinavia. So isn't that cool? So that's one of the other Christmas traditions. In fact, that my wife for the first time ever made a Yule log this year, and we're not Scandinavian. We are part of her family has a Scottish heritage that she celebrates. I have lots of German heritage, so I'm big into the Christmas tree, although not any more than any other American, I would imagine. But there's plenty of different Christmas traditions that you can start, you can pick up. They're not tied to your religion necessarily. They can very much be just an idea of, hey, we're starting a new year, or hey, we're in the darkest part of the winter. We've got to hope for better things to come. And it makes sense that, the end of the year comes. We have New Year's, I'm recording this on New Year's Day, and people make resolutions. The same idea is that we have rebirth and renewal going into the spring season, and we need that rebirth and renewal quite literally to survive, maybe more so in the olden times than we do now. And so we still celebrate those things. And I can just see it being fun. I could see it being a story. I could see it, passing on from generation to generation, and maybe share this story, share this origin with your family and friends. A related but different to the Yule log custom at Christmas time is the decorating and display of a Christmas tree. Now, this has its origin in Northern Europe, not Scandinavia, not that far north, but more like North Central Europe, when it comes to areas that would be, historically France and central areas of what would be considered Germany today, Belgium, those areas. You had the ancient European Gauls, and they had their own pagan beliefs. And what they did during the solstice time is that they would enliven their homes with evergreen branches. And this was a symbol for the life that they hoped would return to their fields and farms as the days grew longer and springtime came. And in this area of Europe, whenever it converted to Christianity, they decided to keep their tradition going for the Christmas holiday. And so they would adorn tree branches and then eventually whole trees that they'd bring inside with apples to symbolize the Garden of Eden. They were actually called paradise trees, which makes sense. Eden was paradise. They'd also add, over the course of time, edible decorations like sugar wafers and nuts. And this, the more modern take on this tradition, and what brought it so much more popularity, and the reason why you and I very likely have a Christmas tree, is because of Queen Victoria in the United Kingdom and her German husband, Prince Albert. He was from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. That was his royal family. And that was... Wait, is it still? They changed the name. The British changed the name of the royal family. It's the House of Windsor now. It was... But Saxe-Coburg and Gotha are related to them somehow. But they were the first. This was the first popular use of the tradition in the Anglo sphere, the English-speaking world. And so, Queen Victoria encouraged her husband, 1848, Prince Albert, to bring in his German trees for Christmas, basically saying, like, you remember these growing up, whenever you were young. How about we do them again? And so what they did was they decorated the tree in their palace with candles and sweets and ornaments, and they put an angel on the top. And because that became the symbol of wealth and the symbol of royalty, lots of people like to imitate the royals even today. They're very influential culturally. And so lots of people decided to do that also in the UK around this time. And then, of course, it went across the pond over here to America. By 1870, German artisans produced delicate glass ornaments, which they exported out to the UK and the US. In the US, by 1882, the first electric tree lights were produced in order to avoid the more dangerous and, quite frankly, incendiary candles, open flames next to a dried out pine tree. Miss me with that, please. That is such a bad idea. Even today, you still have trees getting burned up because of faulty wiring or like really hot bulbs. You don't really have that issue with LED lights anymore, but when I was growing up in the 90s, you definitely still had those bulbs would grow really, really hot sometimes. By the start of the 20th century, so you're going now about 50 years after the first use by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, you had 20% of American families with Christmas trees. I don't know what it was in the UK. I apologize. I didn't look that up. Today you have 3 out of every 4. 75% of American homes have a Christmas tree. And would you say 75% of American homes are Christian? Potentially, but that number's not. It might not be at 75 anymore. There's plenty of people that might not consider themselves to be Christians, but still celebrate Christmas. There's plenty of Jewish people that I know of that celebrate Christmas simply because it's a cultural holiday in the U.S. now. It's very different from the religious holiday that many people that are still religious and faithful, they celebrate it at Christmas. But the rest of the accoutrement, the customs we just mentioned, the idea of evergreens in the house and celebrating on the 25th and gift giving and parties and feasts, literally feasts, you don't have that necessarily tied to the birth of Christ necessarily. And certainly it can be, and it is, but not everybody celebrates that way. And so our Christmas trees now are decorated with electric lights and glass ornaments, although I did switch to plastic. I've got 2 toddlers at home here, almost 4 and over 2 years old. They cannot handle anything that's breakable at this point. I can't handle it either, honestly. Don't want to have it happen. So I've switched to plastic for the most part. There are still some glass ornaments. In fact, I bought some glass ornaments from Germany when I was there this summer and brought them back. And it was from Rothenburg, which is, they're well known for their Christmas market because of their hand-blown, handmade glass ornaments. So I brought a bunch back. Well, not a bunch, a few. Gave them to my mother-in-law, my mother, and kept some for myself. And I was like, that's going to be our thing for Christmas. So we still have many of these traditions. We have these ideas of where they came from, in modern day, came from Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, these German trees, and German American immigrants certainly brought them over in the 19th century, like my family in the 1870s. So you have all these different traditions, the Yule log, the Christmas tree, the celebration of Christmas at the 25th, and then even things like the Nativity being celebrated, or the 12 days of Christmas up to January 6th, still having some connections to pagan roots, not necessarily because they came from pagan roots, but because they were being practiced culturally at the time, or they somehow got associated with the birth of Christ. And it's just a fun time of year. Christmas as we know it today is celebrated on December 25th every year, and is both a sacred religious holiday and a worldwide cultural and commercial phenomenon. For almost 2 millennia, people around the world have been observing it with traditions and customs that are both religious and secular. Christians celebrate Christmas Day as the anniversary of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, a spiritual leader whose teachings form the basis of their religion. Today we have discussed the origins of a few popular Christmas customs, including the exchanging of gifts, the decorating of the Christmas tree, sharing meals with family and friends, festivals and all the other merriment that we have associated with the holiday. So I encourage you to take time this Christmas season and every Christmas season to treat each other with warmth and love, give gifts of your time and treasure, and hope for the coming of the light. Thank you for listening to this episode on Christmas customs. This has been Threads of History. I was your host, Mike Shellhammer. Thank you for listening. You can email your comments and suggestions to threads.historypodcast@gmail.com. Listen to more Threads of History wherever you listen to podcasts. Please come back to listen to more Threads of History.